At this time, you could be fired for being gay. At this time, you can be arrested for showing up in a bar and being your authentic self. At this time, you can't find certain books in certain bookstores, in certain libraries, in certain schools that educate children, people about society and culture. We need more people who are allies to come and stand with us to continue to do this work, to fight and to be able to support LGBTQ rights. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Coaching for Millennials. As always, I'm your host, Jose Miguel Longo, and this is the podcast where you can come listen to meaningful conversations about anything in your career, life, the journey about life, just things that are always top of mind and topics that we're seeing and trending in our life today. This week's episode is a very special one, and for me, obviously, we know that it's the month of June, and June is a celebration of Pride. And I'm going to do something a little different than what I normally do for Pride conversations or for what Pride series would be. I'm not going to do a Pride series this season, particularly around the fact that I think we need to have deeper conversations than to have this big, huge, epic celebration. The world right now is probably more chaotic than we've seen it in a really long time. And as you may already know, there is a huge hostage situation happening in the Middle East with the war between Gaza and Israel and everything else going on. And I don't want to misspeak about what's happening over there because I'm not as educated on it, but I do know that there is not a huge Pride celebration as we would normally see in the Middle East. I know that Israel typically is one of the largest countries that celebrates World Pride and celebrates Pride with a large population of people visiting there for the whole month of June. What I would like to do is have a conversation with you as an audience to provide some awareness and education on top LGBTQ issues taking place in our world. And a lot of this is specifically to the US, not specific to across the globe. I did a bit of research and learning more about what are the stats. So I'll be sharing some stats and I'll include the links to where I found this information in the show notes. So I want to kick off by first saying Pride is just as much a celebration as it is an opportunity to create a space of inclusion and diversity and recognizing that the LGBTQ community has been always in existence. People who are queer, people who identify as gay, lesbian, trans, or whatever that might be and how they want to identify themselves, it's not something that we make a choice to do. And that's a hard thing for people who don't understand LGBTQ individuals to really follow. People always assume that we make the choice to be gay. I didn't choose to be born this way. I was born this way. And a lot of times we find that our path to authenticity sometimes takes longer for others than it does for most people. A lot of people typically will find themselves coming out in their teen era or early 20s. Then there are people who suppress. They don't think that they can fit in this box that society has created for us to really feel like they can embrace and be welcomed into a community, or even for the fact that they've lived their whole entire existence and lives based under what their family beliefs and culture is. And that's a challenge, right? We want people, no matter who you are and where you come from and what your gender is and what your sexual orientation is, to live and be your true authentic self. So I want to highlight that because I think for me, I feel very privileged and honored because I get to speak to people about my sexuality, my sexual orientation, and my identity. I identify as gay, but I also identify as queer. And I also use the pronouns he, him, they. And él for Spanish. I feel that sometimes for me, my identity isn't just always gay. Before coming out, I had relationships with women. I had been engaged to women before. and I felt a strong connection to the female gender. I also found myself when I was in my 20s not necessarily conflicted with what that was, but I found myself being more um, attracted to the person as much as it was to the sex of the person or the gender of the person. And so I realized that I'm not just a gay man, even though I identify as a gay man. I can look at a woman and say, she's beautiful and I'm attracted to her. And that's different for everybody, right? So I could also sit here and talk about how the parts of my identity, being a gay man and Hispanic, are so intertwined. I grew up in a Hispanic household where I never thought that coming out was going to be not necessarily possible, but I think, a thing. Um, I didn't come out until I was 21, 22 years old. And so I had known by the time I was 18, 19 years old that I was gay, but I didn't know before that, even though I had been around gay people, even though I had seen gay people. I just never really in my mind crossed my path. And it's weird to even say that out loud because I feel like I should have known, but irregardless, it is what it is. So I wanted to mention identity and how that's very important to people, creating awareness about your own identity and being able to have a community of people that you can speak to and have that connection to feel safe to talk about who you are and your identity. So much of our LGBTQ plus community is living under, in the closet. And what's really interesting, if you go back and listen to episode 121 with my friend Steve Iacovelli, we talked about your queer career, which is his new book. And I have the book actually right here. And I would highly recommend you can get it for free right now as an ebook. So if you want to get that link, I'll make sure to include it in the show notes. But I think from the perspective of finding your tribe or finding your family, when it comes to being queer and becomes to being part of the LGBTQ community, we often find ourselves in search for people who look like us and look like us and feel like us, and we feel engaged. That happened to me in my 20s, and it created a larger distance from what I had before with my family because I had to discover myself as this person. I had to really figure out who I was as a gay male, as a gay man in this community, and being around people who are the same or similar was important to me. So moving on to other topics, because there's a lot that I want to cover and I want to make sure I give the time and space to cover those. The first, well, not the first thing, let's say the second and third thing that I'm going to move into is talking about what is the significance behind Pride Month. And it's not just for um, gay people, queer people, anybody to come together and celebrate. It is that, but it's so much more. It's also the beginning of what became a riot. Pride started because it was a riot. And this was something that was pivotal in history back in 1969. Why is this so important? It's important because as queer people and as people who are part of the LGBTQ community, there wasn't a voice. People were getting locked up for just being themselves and walking in the street. People were getting locked up for holding hands. People like it was just insane the amount of discrimination and harassment people in the late 60s and early 70s and even before that were getting. What's interesting is that history has always told a really unique story as we paint it. What became Pride was in the Stonewall Inn, which is a gay bar in New York City. And that was the pivotal site of what became the Stonewall riot. And to this day, the Stonewall Inn still stands in New York City. Now, what led to this was years and years and years of police harassing and discriminating against patrons who decided to fight back and decided that they were done with their days of being marginalized and being arrested and being beaten. And the prime person who kind of I don't want to say she led this because I don't know, but she was one of the people who decided that I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to stand up for what is right and for what should be right and as a human being and stand in march. And this person is Marsha P. Johnson. She was a Black trans woman. And then there was another woman, her name is Sylvia Rivera, who was also a Latina trans woman. And these were the leaders who kind of led the LGBTQ right movement. So that's kind of where it all started. Back in 1969, June 28th, 1969, that is the day that is celebrated as Pride Day, the day that the um, riot began and where Pride started. Now, in the year to follow in 1970 was the first Pride parade. And I forget the exact name of what they called it. I'll have to look that up and share that at some point. But essentially, what's really important to know here is that like many other movements that we've seen in history about civil rights and human rights and equality, Pride, like this one, started as a riot. And so we then begin to see, as time goes on, the emergence of allies coming together and the justice and the need for demand for equality. So, really important to note that, wanting to make sure that people are aware that this is a historic moment for us. This is why Pride is celebrated. And I may get some lashback for this, but I feel like I need to say something and I've never want to hold my tongue. For those of you out there, you may not be listening to this podcast because this podcast isn't for you. But if you really think that there should be a heterosexual month, you need to check yourself at the door and look in the mirror because people like you are celebrated every single day for being a cisgendered person and for really being showing up for yourself. And we, unfortunately, have had to fight for a right as human beings to exist amongst you. So it isn't fair to say that you're going to need a heterosexual month or a heterosexual day. You have another 9 months, 10 months, 11 months of the year to celebrate yourself. And here's the thing, Pride is not just a month, Pride is every single day. You should live your life as authentic and as joyful and as transparent and as respectful and as human as you can. So I'm going to get off my soapbox there. I'm going to leave it at that. I want to discuss issues in discrimination and violence when it comes to the LGBTQ community in the US. In 2020, 44 transgender or gender nonconforming people were killed in the US. That was the highest number ever recorded. Now, this was published in the Human Rights Campaign, which is a LGBTQ organization that, well, they're not just LGBTQ, I should rephrase that. They actually fight for human rights and equality. Now, why is this important? We've seen consistently since 2020 more and more events and discrimination and hate acts and even laws that have been put into that have been implemented that discriminate against LGBTQ people, particularly the trans community. Another interesting statistic: LGBTQ youth are more than 4 times likely to attempt suicide compared to their peers. This one came from NAMI, which is the National Association for Mental Awareness and something else. I'm not sure exactly the acronym. That's heartbreaking. I was not a suicidal teenager because I was gay, but I was a suicidal teenager for a lot of different reasons that have to do with mental health. But mental health is critical in the LGBTQ community. It's so hard to sometimes have the conversation with youth because of the fear that they carry in being able to talk about this and being able to communicate what they're experiencing in their lives. It has a lot to do with their family's upbringing and their family values and the culture where they live. And so it's very heartening. And awareness is the theme here. It's awareness on LGBTQ issues today, but they've been happening historically. This is not, we're celebrating Pride, but we need to create awareness around what is happening so we can continue to have pride to celebrate, but also continue the good fight. Okay. And our youth is so important. Um, Next thing is the impact of politics. This is a hard one. So, the impact of politics on LGBTQ rights. So, there's over 400 pieces of anti-trans legislation that has been introduced since 2023 across 36 states. 36 states out of 50 states. That's more than half of this country. And when you think about when gay marriage became legalized, I felt like we took 50 years in the right, 50 years ahead of time in the right direction to now feel like in 2020, 2020 through 2024, we've now become backwards. And it just is insane. Now, here's what some of these pieces of legislation are. It's targeting healthcare access, sports participation, bathroom usage, book bans, which don't even get me about that. People just need to educate themselves to understand what we're living in and what we're dealing with. And we have to come together as a community to really show up, not just for each other, but to create change. The only way that we can create change in our society is by coming together and making a movement like it was back in 1969 and continuing to fight. The other thing that's important is that all of this is political. This is all politically led. And I have to say that people need to start waking up and looking at who they're identifying and choosing to elect into office. The reason these things are happening is because humans who are part of this country that have the right to vote aren't doing their civic duty to actually make sure that the wrong people don't get into office. And clearly, we could see by the likes of so many people who are in office, they're creating these legislative bills that are being passed into law. And for those 36 states, I'm very sad and I feel terrible that so many people are being impacted by that. One of the biggest things we saw in the last year and a half is the book ban. So numerous states have enacted laws and proposed laws banning books, particularly around LGBTQ content as well as race and race theory. And this is just disheartening because it's ultimately creating a block to understanding and being able to see history and learn about culture and inclusivity and diversity and what makes us unique as a country and what makes us unique as people and humans as individuals. There's also the drag ban, which part of the book ban was because of the drag ban, but it first became the books and the drag, and it's all mixed together. But there was this thing called drag queen story time where drag queens would go to schools or cafes or shops and read a book. And it became to create space for inclusivity, safe space for kids, sharing information, educational. That's all it was. And you have these nasty, vicious, hateful people who say that drag queens are pedophiles and they're sexualizing what they're doing by showing up in beautiful costumes and dressing up in drag. Like it's just it's just crazy. There's just a lot of craziness. The drag ban obviously exists in states like Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and so on. And a lot of these things have become laws. These bans aren't just one-time thing. Like you can't show up to certain bars in Tennessee or Oklahoma dressed in drag. And that's just heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. The other thing is, I just read this statistic, 41% of LGBTQ people are still being discriminated in the workplace. Now, this one hits hard because I have always paid attention to people around me in the workplace. And I've always tried to be in a work environment where I didn't put myself in the situation that I would be discriminated. Now, I have been discriminated multiple times, and I've tried to educate people about the conversation and what they're saying and how they're talking and how they're speaking. Um, and it doesn't always create a positive experience after that. And so sometimes it makes it hard because you're scared to, one, be yourself. You're scared to speak on, well, now I'm being attacked because of my sexual orientation, who I am as an individual, and it's not okay. So, I mean, I can create an episode on each one of these topics and go on forever, and that's not what I'm going to do. But I feel like I have to mention pieces of information to make some of this not just relevant, but speak from my experience, which is what I'm here for. Now, how do we take some of these issues? I mentioned 5 things. I mentioned, let's go back, the stats around discrimination, the stats around LGBTQ youth, the stats around anti-trans legislation and laws, the stats around book bans, and then the stats around drag bans, and then the stats around discrimination in the workplace. There's something called the Equality Act that was redone in 2023. I haven't read through it all the way through. I kind of started to read it, I picked it up and put it back down, kind of a thing, but I read it digitally. And I don't feel like a lot of the information that's on there is doing anybody justice in this moment because we have so many of these pieces of legislation that are stuck. And it's just disheartening to know that, like, at this time you could be fired for being gay in some states. At this time you can be arrested for showing up in a bar and being your authentic self. At this time you can't find certain books in certain bookstores, in certain libraries, in certain schools that educate children, people, about society and culture. And this Equality Act is supposed to provide protection to the basic human rights, equal rights of people. I struggled really hard to do this episode. I've actually tried recording it twice because I get really emotional talking about it because sometimes I don't feel safe. I've traveled to certain states in my previous position where I walked into a place that I made sure there was a lot of people publicly, where I knew that if I were to be attacked, other people saw it. I think about all the different experiences that I've had where what I'm seeing, I never thought I would see after knowing that there was a lot of rights in place for LGBTQ people. And there's places right now where I don't ever want to go to. Now, I travel to Florida a lot, but you have to understand something about Florida is that there's so many queer communities, gay communities in Florida, that I actually feel really safe in Florida compared to feeling safe in Texas or safe in Tennessee or safe in Oklahoma or safe in other states that I travel to. So it's hard to talk about this, but I think it's so important to talk about it and create awareness. And the other thing that I'll say is that we need more people who are allies to come and stand with us to continue to do this work, to fight and to be able to support LGBTQ rights and creating inclusion, not just in the workplace, but in society. We can't stand down to the bigotry, to the racism, and to the discrimination of our rights. I can be discriminated for being not just gay, but also Hispanic. And sometimes because I'm a white I look white because I have light skin. As a light skinned Hispanic, I get privileged, but I'm not because I don't identify that way and make it very clear. I'm like, I'm Hispanic, I'm a Dominican. Like, this is my identity, this is who I am. And then there's my queer identity, which I usually say the queer piece first before I say Hispanic because it's so much more closer to my heart and who I am. I will always be Hispanic. Like, they're both so connected to each other. All right. So I don't want to bounce back all over the place. I kind of want to wrap this up. This is a really heavy one, not like my other episodes, but I felt very moved and compelled to want to share this. And I felt like it was really important to really be able to talk about this and have this conversation. What I want to do next before I wrap up the episode is just share some tips on how we can create more support in the community. So part of it has to come from not just LGBTQ people, but it also needs to come from allies. For allies, I think it's important to educate yourself, ask questions, look for ways to become more aware with LGBTQ terminology, really understanding some of the resources and understanding people and connecting with people. Become part of an ERG group, which is Employer Resource Group. Speak up, activate yourself, really become part of the conversation to create inclusivity. Participate in LGBTQ events and celebrations. There's a lot of them happening this month. I also think it's important to support LGBTQ youth. There's a lot of bullying that happens with youth, especially kids who are in middle school and high school. And there are organizations out there. I used to volunteer at the Q Center, which supported LGBTQ youth. And there's a lot of organizations out there that can help and you can be part of and become a member and look for ways to engage. Also look at, if you're looking at LGBTQ specifically, look at inclusive anti-bullying policies that are in your area that can support and help your community. The other thing I'll mention is looking at how can we create a call to action for each other. For me, I know I missed May as a mental health awareness month. It kind of got away from me. And I was also struggling a little bit more in May than I normally would have, even though I had a lot of things going on. But it's always a challenge when you suffer from mental health. Every day is a different day, and you show up as best as you can, and you show up for yourself to do what you need to do. It's so important to identify and understand what are the mental health resources, not just only for LGBTQ people, but just everyone in general. I think when you talk about LGBTQ, there's like an asterisk that says mental health because we all have some form of anxiety, depression that really hinders us from potentially living truly authentic lives. And some days are better than others, depending on how do you engage and how you choose to help support your mental health. For me, it's working out and going to the gym and talking to people and creating awareness and creating space for it. So really educate yourself on how mental health impacts LGBTQ people and youth, but also how can you support and be part of the conversation. The next thing is creating inclusive spaces at work. This is an important one because you want to foster a positive and engaging and welcoming workspace. Creating You Belong or creating communities of belonging or ERG groups that foster this positive influence. If you have questions on how to do those and how to create those, feel free to ask me. I've created multiple organizations across different businesses and companies that I've worked at. I would also refer you to my friend Steve's book, Your Queer Career, which he talks a little bit about that as well in this particular book. And there's a lot of advice from a lot of different people who are allies and are part of the queer community. So I want to leave you with a quote actually two quotes. The first one is one I recently posted on Instagram that really was it hit hard for me, and I post this every year. It's from Harvey Milk. If you don't know who Harvey Milk is, there's actually a movie about him. But he was the first openly gay elected official in San Francisco, and he was actually killed in San Francisco. But he was a big activist and he was part of San Francisco's gay pride and their riots that were there. It says, "Take no compromise to give people their rights." Let me say that again. It takes no compromise to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual. It takes no political deal to give people freedom. It takes no survey to remove repression. I think for this conversation today, this quote stands out more than the one that I was going to read, but I will read the other one anyways. This one is, "We're all human beings. We all deserve the same respect and dignity. It's important we stand together and celebrate our diversity." Having said all that, happy Pride Month. I hope that for anyone who's listening or watching this, that you have a stronger connection to understanding the LGBTQ community and the issues we face in society today. If you're an ally, please stand up. If you're not an ally and you want to become an ally, please ask questions. Feel free to connect with me. I'm happy to do so and talk and share resources and help you guide this information. And if you're part of the queer community, I love you. I support you. I stand with you. And I can't wait to celebrate Pride with you. Till the next one. Bye.